All right, well, welcome to our last talk of day one. I hope you've had a great high score so far. And we're going to cap off day one with a talk from Christoph Jakob. Now, he is joining us all the way from Germany. There he is. And he's going to be showcasing the use of audio design and music to communicate secrets, progression, and change in the indie roguelike Revita.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. Hello and welcome everyone to this little presentation about Revita, specifically the audio design and the music to communicate secrets, progression, and change. First, I'd like to introduce myself real quick and say a few things about the game itself. Then I've planned to give you a very quick breakdown of the soundtrack as a whole, and then a deeper dive into secrets, change, and progression in Revita, but first in music, and then I'd like to show you some some sound design examples as well. Yeah, as you've heard, my name is Christoph Jakob. I've been a professional freelance composer and sound designer since 2017. I'm basically entirely self-taught. I do have some education here and there, but actually nothing that's really relevant for this presentation. I've been writing my own music since 2008. This might be one of my only regrets, that it took me until 2017 to actually take the leap and try to give this a professional try. Play a couple of instruments, guitar and bass especially. And I also love video games, love playing video games myself a lot. One little thing, how did I even get into composing? It's quite funny. It all started in 2008, more or less randomly or by coincidence, you can say. I downloaded something called Mario Paint Composer, which is based on an old SNES game called Mario Paint, which had a section, you can say, where you could compose your own little tunes. It was very simplistic, but that's pretty much how I accidentally taught myself how to compose music and how to take apart the music from others. Yeah. Revita is a fast twin-stick roguelite shooter. You can also call it an action platformer or an adventure game. It fits a lot of different genres, which has procedurally generated encounter rooms, which basically means that every time you play this game, the rooms that you play through look differently. They are randomly generated. And what makes Revita so special, at least in my opinion, is that health is not just your health, but it also serves as the game's main currency. And finding the right balance between knowing when it's better to keep your health and when you can allow yourself to actually spend some of your health is crucial if you want to progress in this game. You more or less wander through 5 different areas as an unnamed child who's trying to ascend a clock tower. You don't know who you are, you don't know why you're there, you just know that you need to reach the top of this clock tower. And funnily enough, the 5 bosses that you're facing along the way are named after the 5 stages of grief. More about that later. In case you've never heard of this game, here is the official announcement trailer that released in April this year, with music by yours truly. quite an epic trailer. I'd like to start this breakdown of the soundtrack by showing you the main theme of the game. This is one of only 2 tracks that I'd like to show you full if time allows for it, that is. There are actually 2 different variations of this main theme, which will lead us into the main part of this presentation later. At the left, you can see the game's title screen, which is very open, very wide, and so is the music. Whereas the file select screen version, it's the same song, but it's mixed in a way that it's supposed to sound as if it's coming out of the speakers of this metro that Revita Kid is sitting in. And basically, when you move from the title screen to the file select screen, both those tracks, they crossfade into one another. So the title screen fades out and the file select screen variation fades in, more or less seamlessly. And I'd like to show you this in full. Also, so that you get a rough idea of what the mood of the soundtrack is about. And now you can hear the file select screen version. Back to the title screen. Yeah, I'd say roughly a third or so of the soundtrack is constructed this way, that you have 2 or more different versions that more or less, yeah, either replace each other or are stacked on top of each other. More on that in a second. You could probably also hear that it wasn't really happy. It also wasn't really sad, the music, right? It was very melancholic, which is the, by far, I'd say, most prominent ingredient on the soundtrack. Ben's, the lead developer for this game, specifically told me for every single track that I should always try to make the music have at least a sense of somberness, melancholy, or just emptiness. And there are different ways, lots of different ways how you can achieve that. I more or less looked a little at how Hollow Knight did it. And half of the instrumentation that I use for the soundtrack is more or less borrowed from Hollow Knight, which is piano and cello and some solo voices. I also think that specific chords and chord shapes by nature tend to sound melancholic. Basically, most chords with a 9 in their name just tend to sound not happy, but also not sad. They just sound so ambiguous, like nothing, which makes sense. And I also like to actually focus my melody hard on those. I've written down as chord extensions, basically sevenths and ninths and everything above. I try to focus hard on those notes because, at least to me and also to Ben, that seems to evoke melancholy and just in general makes melodies very memorable, in my opinion. Overall, I tried to have music that is somewhat predictable, but with some surprise elements here and there, which means either a sudden key change or sound effects or something that you just wouldn't expect. All of that contributes to a sense of melancholy, I'd say. I'd like to show you a part of Ticking Tower Top, which is the final area of the game. It's overall, yeah, I'd say kind of hopeful sounding, maybe, but it still has a lot of melancholy in it, and you're about to hear why. The melody starts on a 9th. I can't spoil that. This here. And focus on the 9th again. And so on. And that's something that I didn't just do for this track, but I tried to do this for as many tracks as possible, basically. Before we take a deeper dive into the actual topic of this presentation, I quickly want to also talk about leitmotifs and what I call their narrative function. If you look up what a leitmotif is, you find something like it's a recurrent theme throughout a musical or literary composition associated with a particular person, idea, or situation. In the context of Revita, I made up my own definition, basically. It's a recurring sequence of notes, chords, or entire sections that is tied to a specific character, location, event, or setting. Now, you might be wondering, why do I even talk about leitmotifs now? The thing is, in my opinion, if you use leitmotifs in a purposeful way, you're able to basically tell a story or, tell a story without using a single word. Just through the power of music, so to speak, you can make it clear that a character and a location, that they belong together, for example. There are 4 leitmotifs in Revita. The main leitmotif that you can see at the top, is usually either a 4 or 8 note figure that doesn't really serve a narrative function. It's something that I just try to include or hide in as many tracks as possible. This na, 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 na. You might have heard that in the main theme or in the trailer theme. And the only track where it actually does serve a narrative function is in the Game Over theme, because that's the only time in the entire soundtrack where this main leitmotif falls apart, which makes sense considering it's a game over theme. And it sounds like this. Yeah, it pretty much just falls apart. The second motif, we called that internally the boss leitmotif. It's a pretty long motif, but the main part, also once again, the first half is what I try to include into pretty much every boss theme that isn't the final boss theme in this game. And funnily enough, this boss leitmotif is more prominent in the main theme than the actual main leitmotif itself, which just goes to emphasize how important the function of these bosses are in the context of the game. Apparently, you're a kid who's going through the 5 stages of grief for some reason. That's what the player thinks, at least. And it sounds like this. This is the boss theme, by the way, the regular boss theme, the climax part. Just so that you heard it once. Now, the two lore-wise more interesting leitmotifs. The first one is the acceptance leitmotif. As you probably know, the last stage of grief is acceptance. And the only other time where this leitmotif plays apart from the fight itself against acceptance is after you've beaten acceptance. You would expect some sort of somewhat happy or relieving credits theme, but you hear a game over-like theme with this acceptance leitmotif in it, which should clearly tell the player that this just can't be the true ending of the game. It sounds like this. And the ending theme is this. Doesn't really sound like it's over. And lastly, we have what we call the mother leitmotif, which is basically hidden in every major track beyond acceptance. Because at one point, Revita Kid tries to get out of this cycle of grief. And mother leitmotif sounds like na, 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 na. Why is it called mother leitmotif? I think this would take too long to explain now. It has to do with the real, true final boss of this game. This is the theme of Mother. And this is her area theme. Pretty much starts with the main leitmotif and it keeps coming back over and over. And so on. This should clearly tell the player that you can basically say that this entire area belongs to Mother because this leitmotif appears in her theme and all over the area track where she is hiding. All right. Now I'd like to talk a little about more specific secrets, change, and progression in Revita. And I'd like to start with what is called vertical layering. There are, I think, 11 or 12 area tracks in this game. And all those area tracks have a basic and an intense version, which means the basic version plays the entire time. And as soon as enemies are nearby, additional instruments, for example, a cello or double bass or more drums, more percussion, stuff like that, will be added on top of the currently playing track to make it a little more intense. Why we wanted it to be perceivable, we still wanted it to be somewhat subtle so it doesn't distract the player too much from the gameplay experience. You can see it in action in this little video here. As soon as Revita Kid enters the elevator, try paying attention to what's happening with the music. Once again. Yeah. So in this particular example, the basic version didn't even have a kick drum, which just made the intense version kick much more once the kick and also some other instruments were added. Some area tracks are already quite intense by nature, though, so finding a healthy balance between what to put into the basic version and what to put into the intense version is really important. I'd like to show you a track that's called Corrupted as an example, which is very intense by nature, but we still managed to give it an intense version that doesn't distract the player too much. But it's, once again, it's still noticeable. Whoop. This is the basic version right now, and you can hear additional drums coming in. And an electric guitar. Now they're gone again. Once again. Yeah, writing this kind of music requires a lot of prior communication with the developer, of course. It should be pretty obvious. The next, I call the next chapter More Examples of Dynamic Music, because there are some differences to these area tracks that we just heard 2 examples of. And I'd like to quickly talk about Memoria Station, which serves as the game's hub world, basically the place you return to whenever you fail or you beat a run. It has basically 2 entirely different songs that play depending on whether you're on the upper section of this area or the lower section. And you can also hear that in the music. It's once again subtle, but the lower version, for example, instead of having a high voice, it has a low voice. And instead of just having a cello, it has a cello and a double bass. Also, the piano has a downward tendency, whereas in the upper version, it has an upwards tendency. Now you may wonder, why put so much effort into something so seemingly minor? And might be a boring answer, but if time and resources allow for it, then honestly, why not? It's stuff like this, in my opinion, that can really set an experience apart from something, or make a game and a soundtrack special. And yeah, you can hear it and also see it in action here. Let's see if you can, yeah, come on. you can if you can figure out the differences. This is the lower version now. As soon as upper version. Yeah. In case you're wondering how we implemented that, it's basically just two different songs that need to have the exact and really exact same length. And one of them is just muted while the other is playing, and they crossfade into each other depending on where you are. A similar example is Murky Merchandise, the game's shop theme, which is even a little more crazy, you can say, because it's basically two entire songs that also work on their own. All the examples from previously, excluding Memoria Station, yeah, they only worked in combination. If you just listen to an intense version of an area track alone, it's just not working. But here, you also have a basic version, basically, that's playing the entire time. And as soon as the player gets closer to the merchant's tent, some sort of radio tune starts playing as well. And when you move away again, it's fading out again. Stuff like this is good for immersion, I'd say, immersing the player into a game. There it comes. And gone it is. There are also what we call music that indicates change. And it's mostly boss themes. Boss themes are split up in a phase 1 and a phase 2 version, which means phase 1 version plays until the boss is at roughly 50% of the health, and then a phase 2 version kicks in. Typical changes are more instruments, or the song gets a little faster. One song even gets longer. And we also try to give it a unique intro cue, which leads directly into the song's climax to avoid going through this build-up again and again. And just to show you this, a quick example that I also showed you earlier, this is how the climax of the boss theme from phase 1 sounds like compared to phase 2. Once again, the differences are kind of subtle, apart from one instrument that you're gonna hear now. And phase 2. Yeah, this phase 2 version it pretty much fulfilled all criteria that I just talked about. More instruments, it was faster. You couldn't hear that here, but it has a different loop point. And we added a huge choir on top that is singing the name of the tune itself, honestly, just because it's fun. Something I haven't talked about yet at all is progression. And I'm going to read something that Ben wrote me. The Void. The Void is the final challenge the game can throw at you while in a run, after fulfilling some very specific criteria. While mechanically it is basically a culmination of all previous areas into one, from a world-building perspective, it represents the inner void of the game's antagonist, Mother, her broken mind, an endless void with no end. So basically, this is an optional 7th area, 5 stages of grief. It's more like 6 stages of grief, and it still keeps going. And I call it an extreme example for vertical layering, because the further you progress, the more the music changes, which is not an arbitrary decision, but I'd say it's very important actually for this track, for this area, because you start in some sort of, you can call it mini hub world maybe, or mini room, and after every 5th enemy encounter room, you come back to this room and you get some sort of reward, and then you move on. If I'm not mistaken, visually you don't really notice any progression, but you hear the progression, because at the beginning of this area you just hear some synth sounds and a piano, and if I'm not mistaken, it's like 8 or 9 different layers at the end that are all playing at the same time. And on the original soundtrack, this tune is 10 minutes long, but I tried to cut it down so that it's 2 minutes long. And I'd also like to show you this tune in full so that you get a sense for this progression. Bass coming in and reverse hi-hats. More synth sounds coming in. And not all of those additional instruments are super noticeable. Yeah, and just so that you get an idea how this tune actually started, I'd like to play the first 5 seconds again. It was very empty. No? Yeah. The main inspiration for that was Celeste, by the way, which I just want to mention here, which is a great game. And if you know Celeste, then it's pretty obvious that this tune was inspired by Celeste. All right. Last chapter for today is some interesting uses of sound design. There are so-called secret rooms in this game. They can appear in every area. I think it's usually 2 or 3 different secret rooms that you can find if you know how to find them. There are both visual and audio indicators to communicate where those secret rooms may hide. Obviously, for accessibility reasons, we didn't just want to have audio indicators only. It wouldn't be fair towards someone who's deaf, for example. And in this first little example, I'd like you to pay attention to what happens to the music when Revita child is approaching the wall to the right. There it is, yeah. You basically have to pay attention to the music because it doesn't disappear entirely, but it fades, it gets really quiet. And then you just shoot at the wall right next to you, basically. And once you've defeated all the enemies in the area room, you can access the secret room. Now, a little more complicated, or not necessarily complicated, but a little harder to notice are what we call super secret rooms. And I'd like you to not pay attention to the music, but pay attention to what's happening with the sound effects when shooting a specific wall here. Also, once again, to the right. Sounds different, right? Yeah, Revita Kit was pretty much, oh, it keeps going. Revita Kit, if you shoot at the wall above the secret room, it just gives, you can just hear this dull sound effect. But this small part at the bottom right, it shares the same sound effect with the sound effect that plays when you're shooting at an enemy, which is, in this case, our indicator that a secret is hiding there. And lastly, I'd like to quickly talk about something that I just called secrets, hidden details, and Easter eggs, mostly because they didn't quite fit any of the categories that I made up so far. Revita has a huge amount of tunes. I didn't even mention that. I think there are 57 tunes in this little game. Or 57 tunes are on the soundtrack and 56 are in the game. And I think like 13 or 14 are entirely optional, and you can pretty much find them in the game. So that I don't forget anything, let me quickly read this as well. Examples include the tune of a huge pink frog king, which sounds weird without context. Pretty much another area, hidden area, 5 accordion arrangements of Revita tracks, and 5 tracks that we called alt tracks. Basically, each area has a roughly 1% chance to have completely different music playing. And there's not really a narrative function behind that or anything like that. It's just that I was making music for a different game by Ben as well, which never came to be. And we wanted to, basically, we didn't want this music to go to waste. And yeah, Ben was pretty much inspired by a game called Spelunky, which also does something like that. And we pretty much, yeah, stole sounds too negative, but we got inspired by this idea. Yeah, the choir and Tenebris Mentis sings the name of the tune. Yeah, that's not really that interesting, to be honest, but let's take a look. We still have a minute, right? Or 2 minutes. The last 2 points are really interesting, in my opinion. We also included secrets that pretty much serve for world building, and also have some secrets hidden in them. Last Refuge is something that you already heard earlier. I called it Area 6 when I was talking about the so-called mother leitmotif. And it has a part where a cult-like choir sings some sort of gibberish. But if you pay super close attention, it's actually not gibberish, but this choir is singing in Latin. And this choir is quoting Ovid's Metamorphoses. More precisely, a part an entire passage, basically. Let me quickly check that, about death and losing a loved one, which ties in quite nicely to the lore of this game. And that's the last example I'd like to show you for today. Or before I play it, you could also say that this is kind of unnecessary, but to be honest, most gamers like looking for secrets like that, right? All right, last example then. Sounds a little creepy, right? Yeah. If we still have some time, I'd like to talk about this last bullet point as well. If we don't, then...
I reckon we do. Go for it.
Yeah. So this very last point is also quite important, actually. All the NPCs in the game, they speak some sort of made-up language, which is a combination of Latin, Japanese, and actual gibberish. I'm a bit of a language nerd, so I try to to include some secrets into what those characters are saying, and I also made up this language, which also once again helps get you an idea of, or how do I put it? Even if the language is technically undecipherable and gibberish with some secrets, it kind of makes sense, and it can make you feel that this is one coherent, consistent world, basically. It's once again I've got a few examples here for how this language sounds like.
Ah, kona semiferum.
Plena meriatingit.
Oh, pectomentum. Aha, Naguri! I Naguri!
Juvena Ceriberion.
Pectomentum.
Shicho, psycho hero.
That was obviously Japanese.
Sagabria umbra.
Noro wareta.
Pona gade taskete.
Zacabria. Kona miseria.
No. 無理だ。Negazio!
Yeah, like I said, making up an entire language, even though it doesn't even have grammar or anything like that, it's just some words from Japanese and words from Latin and some actual gibberish that I threw into a blender. It can really make a game very interesting. This was also once again inspired by Hollow Knight, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a huge inspiration for this game as a whole. And yeah, like I also said during the Memoria Station part, if time and resources allow for it, and you can include secrets like this that I talked about today, then why not just go for it? It's by no means necessary, I'd say, but to me at least, and I know that Ben also has an unhealthy obsession with with details. Love to detail really shows that you care, that you really care about a product, about a game or soundtrack, that you can hopefully look back at in, like, I don't know, 10 years and still look at it with pride and say, I was part of this, and I'm glad. Yeah. That was it from my side. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much. I love that because I'm a huge detail nerd as well, and getting a little bit of an insight into everything that you've put in is really, really cool. So thank you for sharing that with us. We have a couple of questions for you. Do you mainly work with other German-based devs? If not, how did you connect with devs from other countries?
Yeah, that's actually quite funny. I think Germany, I barely ever work with people from Germany. Yeah, so Revita is the huge exception there, actually. I got most of these gigs, as we say, right, kind of randomly, I'd say, either through Twitter or some sort of Discord server, or I'm a little old school maybe. I still sometimes check out forums.
I love how everything comes back to Twitter and Discord nowadays. It's just, I swear, especially the Australian industry, everyone lives on Twitter.
Yeah, it's the same here, yeah. Twitter and Discord. But funnily enough, I got Revita through YouTube, which is pretty unusual, I'd say. Back when YouTube still had this personal message function that they got rid of in 2016 or 2017. In 2015, I was uploading what I called fan-made Mario and Luigi music. I wasn't doing this professionally back then. I just wanted to share some of my kind of cheap music with the world. And one of my only, 12 viewers on average happened to be Ben, who a year later or so reached out to me and asked me if I want to write music for his fan-made Mario game. And once again, a year later, he asked me if I wanted to write music for his game Revita that he just started. So this is just luck, to be honest, being at the right place at the right time.
It's incredible that you really never know where something's gonna go. Just 12 viewers, and one of them can be a connection, can be important.
Yeah.
How do you balance work life when so much of what you're working on is done remotely?
Yeah, to be honest, I think that's something I still need to work on a little. I don't really separate these two that much. So I need to be careful, especially burnout is something that's in my opinion very dangerous, because you only ever notice it when it's basically too late.
That's okay. We've all got things we're learning. It's fine. You'll get there.
Yeah. These days I'm basically just trying to take at least one day off, and I'm also not working 8 hours a day, but I try to do like 3 or 4 hours, but every day, which at least for me and my life works just fine. It probably depends on you as a person, though.
Wonderful. And we have one last question. When working with your leitmotifs, what strategies do you use to develop and vary them, retaining their identity while simply repeating/looping them?
Yeah, I think it's very important for a leitmotif that it's simple, very simple, and that it's just recognizable in different contexts. Like you heard the leitmotifs I was talking about. The boss leitmotif was a little longer, but all the other ones were very short. And if it's short and if it's in its how do you say, in its first initial form, if it doesn't sit on unusual or out of key notes, but if it's yeah. That's hard to explain, actually.
I guess maybe it's a bit of a practice makes perfect, and play around, find what works for you.
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for all of your insights and for joining us.
Yeah, thanks again for having me.